afternoon and welcome to this, our third webinar in the InterReach webinar series. Today we're going to be discussing best practices in measuring our impact. This is a topic that came to our attention thanks to Nancy Devino, who is going to be acting as today's moderator. This is Amanda McMillan. I'm the Education Program Manager for the Duke Clinical and Translational Science Institute, and along with Karen Demby, my colleague at UNC, we oversee this webinar series, and so we'll be acting as today's hosts. Here you see just a quick agenda of the topics that we're going to be covering today. Obviously, this is our welcome and introduction section. Then we're going to hear from three different speakers, whom I'll introduce in just a moment, regarding their perspectives on measuring impact in their work. We'll reserve some time for questions for presenters, and then also ask you, our participants, to give us some information on how you measure and communicate impact in your own professional spheres. The end goal of this exercise is to begin developing a set of metrics for measuring impact of the work that we do. So we'll get to that as we wrap up, but let me introduce today's presenters. As I said, Nancy Devino, who is a Research Development Associate at Georgia Tech, is the facilitator for today and is the person who actually proposed this topic to us following our last webinar. So thank you, Nancy, for your input in that regard. She's joined today by Kris Lund, a Senior Research Engineer at the University of Lyon in France. So Kris is actually 6 hours ahead of us, so we thank her for taking some time out of her early evening to join us today. We also have Betsy Rolland, the Assistant Director of Population Sciences at the University of Wisconsin Carbone Cancer Center. So thank you, Kris and Betsy, for joining us. As we move through the various presentations, I hope you'll keep in mind some of the questions that are listed here on this slide. These were included in the webinar invite and sort of set the ground, lay the groundwork for the kind of discussion that we hope to tackle later on. So obviously the first question deals with the metrics and how we define contributions to research development. Also how we articulate those contributions to our institutional leadership for professional acknowledgement and advancement purposes. We have a second question to consider regarding the primary knowledge, skills, and abilities that add value in our jobs, what's rewarded in our work, and also how do we communicate our long-term impact. So keep those in the back of your mind as we proceed through the various talks in quick succession. So, as I said, we will be hearing from three individuals, starting today with Kris Lund, again at the University of Lyon. So I will now hand it off to Kris. Thanks so much.
Okay, hello everybody. This is Christine Lund from the University of Lyon and the French CNRS. Thank you for the invitation today. Before I get started, I will give a brief introduction to my background. So I am currently what's called a Senior Research Engineer in Human and Social Sciences in the French CNRS. I am a team leader in the language sciences laboratory called ICAR, and I served as vice director of this laboratory from 2007 to 2010. We have about 60 permanent members and at any given time around 180 PhD students in this laboratory. But what I'm going to talk about today is a position to which I was appointed. I was recently appointed coordinator of what we call here academic colleges. The one I am coordinating is called EduCola, in French, Éducation, Cognition et Langage. So that is Education, Cognition, and Language in the Lyon-Saint-Étienne region. So this is what I'm going to focus on today. And before I get into that, I'll just give you a brief synopsis of my diplomas. Most recently, I got what's called a habilitation in educational sciences. This is a degree that doesn't exist in the U.S., exists in France, Germany, and some Asian countries, where at one point after your PhD, you look back on the work that you've done with a certain pair of glasses that you invent, and then you define a research program for the next 10 years. I also hold a PhD in cognitive science, a Master of Artificial Intelligence. Both are from France, and I got my first degree in computer science, a Bachelor of Arts from Gustavus Adolphus College in Minnesota. Okay, so this is a brief reminder of the questions addressed by this webinar. I'm going to address those in bold. What metrics can we use to define contributions to research development? I'll touch on what are the primary knowledge, skills, and abilities that add value to our jobs as related to team science. And I'll focus on what is rewarded in our work. This is a tougher question for me. And how do we communicate our long-term impact on the institution when our performance is assessed on an annual basis? So in order to answer these questions, then I will give you the local context here in my area in France. So we are competing with other French cities for what's called an Initiative of Excellence. For short, we call this the IDEX. And this is crucial for governmental funding currently. So you can see why. The interest from 800 million euros, that's going to give us something like 30 million euros per year, will be available here locally to compete for within a local governance structure that we are currently now putting together. And we're going to know fairly soon if we've been successful in this bid. The kind of project that we put together is articulated around three kind of typical mechanisms. Shared actions that has to do with the attractiveness of our region here in France, entrepreneurship, these academic communities that I'm going to talk about, collège académique in French, and the interdisciplinary scientific programs that are made possible because of this local governance structure that we're putting together. So here are the 8 academic colleges in the Lyon and Saint-Étienne Rhône-Alpes region. The one I'm coordinating is on education, cognition, and language. So these are all the disciplines that have these areas as themes of study. And if we are successful, then the dozen or so large topics that we've already identified will have research programs and training programs built up around them. Since the vocabulary here is around excellence, this is the Initiative of Excellence. We already have laboratories of excellence. We call them LabEx, and our laboratory, ICAR, that I mentioned in the introduction, is part of a LabEx on the complexity of language. And because we're already in this structure, then that makes us eligible to propose what we're calling university research schools, which can be compared to graduate schools in the United States. And so this is a kind of institutional, how should I say this, way of progressing that has been set up in terms of how we're thinking of governance. If you already have a laboratory of excellence, you're being pushed to do a university research school, because if you stay in a laboratory of excellence, those that are not yet organized into these LabExes are not able to. So the interdisciplinary groups that are beginning to be formed can only do laboratories of excellence if those who are laboratories of excellence move to university research schools. So part of this process has been to write up what we've been calling a prospective document. So each of the academic colleges had to do this. In our academic college, Education, Cognition, and Language, one of the first things that we were confronted with, well, all of the academic colleges were, what do we name ourselves? One of the problems we had, we initially thought that maybe the learning sciences would be pertinent as a name, learning sciences, cognition, and language, but that didn't seem to, there were some problems with that. First of all, learning sciences is in English, and we are a French organization, and learning sciences is also not on the same level as cognition and language, and a little bit tighter of a focus than education. So we figured education, cognition, and language was a better theme for a better name for our academic college. Each of those themes are more on the same level, and it gives us a broader perimeter. So, of course, naming the perimeter pertinently is an important aspect. We needed to also build a representative pilot committee, and this was more difficult than anticipated. So one of the things that I suggested is that we take the education, cognition, and language themes, and we try to get people on our piloting committee from those who wanted to be volunteers, to see if we actually adequately represented the different research structures and the different diplomas that we had in each of these areas. And so it turns out that in this way we were able to adequately represent the perimeter, but we had some difficulties. For example, even in managing definitions of democracy, the people representing the education theme said, well, we've got, I think it's 5,000, it might be 6,000 students in education, so as a result of that, we should have more seats on the piloting committee. Now that can be called tyranny of the majority. There's another way to talk about democracy as an equal representation of the themes that take an importance from in terms of the contributions done in research as well. So it's a matter of juggling these different ways of organizing representativity on this piloting committee. So one of the other things we did as well, you can see here we have a mission statement that's fairly typical. We want to produce, disseminate, and perform outreach for original research at the crossroads of education, cognition, and language. And so we're starting with actually 2 laboratories of excellence. I've already mentioned ASLAN, which is the Laboratory of Excellence for Advanced Studies on the Complexity of Language, and that's the one that my laboratory is in. There's another one that is more in neuroscience and cognitive psychology called Cortex, so dealing with the rehabilitation and the reparation of the cortex. We have another federation, so this isn't currently funded, and it's more the education theme, Research in Education, Lyon and Saint-Étienne. This is the acronym. And this is what should really become a laboratory of excellence in the future, if we can organize it that way. In terms of what our perimeter is across all the higher education institutions in this area in France, we collectively defined it. You can see the types of structures that exist in our perimeter. One thing that I could mention briefly is that because of different disciplinary practices, people wanted to define this perimeter in different ways. For example, if you have one person working on one project in one laboratory that is pertinent for our perimeter, but this laboratory really belongs elsewhere in a different academic college, can this be viewed as a strength or as a weakness for our own perimeter? And I think there are different ways to frame that, maybe even in both directions. So I thought this was an interesting point. Finally, one of the things we did also was to define our thematic strengths and perhaps our emerging projects in education, cognition, and language. And here I want to mention the power of naming. Of course, this wasn't just done by chance. These are actual themes that have some strengths to them in our perimeter. But the simple fact that they exist now in this document have given them more power in relation to perhaps other themes that may have equivalent research capacity or already researchers that have delivered on these themes. And so this is just an important aspect to keep in mind in these kinds of interdisciplinary situations, just the simple fact of naming themes, how that can give power. This is the last slide before I get to the questions. This is one of the ways of qualifying the University School of Research or graduate schools that I mentioned that the laboratories of excellence are supposed to now strive towards. We need to develop the links between cognition, language, and education by framing different problems together across these disciplines. So already from what we call in French the problématisation phase. And we need to think about how our diplomas can be mutualized, how our courses can move together. Develop new training and research with other partners outside of our academic perimeters. So this moves more towards transdisciplinary research. And let's see then, let's move on to answering the questions in this particular context. So what are the kinds of metrics that we can use? This may seem very basic, but we had a lot of difficulty. And so just in the having success in constituting an academic college piloting committee that is accepted by the participating disciplines and that is seen as actually really fairly representing the perimeter in language sciences, cognitive science, and educational sciences. So we did succeed in that. It is a metric. Of course, locating potential synergies, both in research and training, within the strong research teams and across perimeters of the academic colleges. We're in the process of doing this. This has to do with the power of naming the themes, but we need better communication. We all know the stories of how we don't even discuss sometimes with our colleagues in the office next door, and we find out what they do when we see each other at a conference across the ocean. We're all maybe a little bit guilty of that. One of the things, for example, we've selected, or actually the Life Sciences and Health Academic College has asked us to participate in a workshop about transhumanism. So this is a way where we can work together across these different disciplines. Of course, we need to be able then to actually build different structures that get funded by the EDEX, and more typically increase citations, increase international visibility, attractiveness of the region for visiting scholars. These are all very typical indicators. One that might not be as typical is making cluster hiring an institutional norm, rationalizing large equipment purchases across institutions in the whole region. This would be quite a feat if we succeeded in doing so, but could be a money saver and an instigator for collaboration. In terms of the skills and abilities that add value to our jobs as related to team science, here I tried to think of how I could bring to bear my own research on this type of work. My research focuses on the analysis of group interactions in general, with or without the support of technologies, and also in interdisciplinary contexts. And this book from Springer, the first one, Productive Multivocality in the Analysis of Group Interactions, really talks about the different ways in which knowledge about different disciplinary practices can be either fruitfully or combined, but also the difficulties that we face and how we can surmount those difficulties when we're in these kinds of situations. Of course, the knowledge of research strengths in the region. Here in my context, it's really the region of Lyon and Saint-Étienne that we need to know in order to build projects. Argumentation, negotiation, and consensus building skills are all very basic in cultivating a social network as well. The rewards in our work, I think this is a difficult question. I mentioned that in the beginning. I see the reward as being more relevant at the community level. We can see the fruits that that are the consequence of our labors, in a sense. If we wanted to look at a reward at the personal level, other than thinking that, okay, there's a job well done, the metrics mentioned previously could be harnessed perhaps if we begin to call ourselves interdisciplinary integration specialists, and if we can bring these metrics into some kind of discussion about our own promotions, This could be the basis for a personal reward. But at the same time, the question that I asked then at that point, well, these are all kinds of, in these last two slides, collective enterprises. So how can a single coordinator role be successfully qualified in these kinds of collective dynamics? And finally, an open question is, how can the institutions make the responsibility of leading such efforts attractive to individuals? Here in my case, I was appointed. I accepted this appointment. It's completely voluntary. I wouldn't have had to do it. And many people refuse. So how this is really an important question that I'm looking to get advice on. How can institutions make this responsibility attractive? Thank you for listening.
Okay, so I want to tell you a little bit about what challenges we face here in Atlanta. And what you're seeing in front of you is sort of a metaphor for some of the teams that I deal with. Those of you from the upper Midwest may realize that with a half an inch of snow like what you have on here, we descend into chaos in Atlanta. And the work here with the teams in some ways is a little bit similar. So go ahead and click again. So how do I get from that to this? Okay. This is still pretty busy, pretty involved, but it's not the chaos of cars and things going everywhere, which is really what I walked into about a year and a half ago at Georgia Tech. Next slide, please. So I'll tell you a little bit about the position that I occupy. It was a new position created in August 2015. It's shared between the Office of the Provost and the Executive Vice President for Research, about 80-20. But as you know, when you split time like that, it really becomes about 90-90. Very involved kind of job. But what I also walked into was a highly decentralized administrative structure. They'd never had research development before. This was new to the culture of the campus, where people work very well as individuals and less successfully in larger teams. There's also a high degree of suspicion from anything coming out of central administration. So we have a very decentralized activity, both by faculty, by deans, by school chairs. At Georgia Tech, the language of a department is called a school. So kind of learning all of that. But within the context of the Executive Vice President for Research, within the job description, there are two specific tasks. One was to facilitate interdisciplinary team formation, taking those cars scattered everywhere and getting them all lined up heading the same direction, and then also to coordinate the development of complex collaborative grant proposals. So those are the main things that I do in the 20% of my time that is devoted to team science type activities. Next slide, please. So really then what the questions become, and I pose this topic as a webinar more out of interest to see what everyone else is doing, more so than that I have answers, because being that it's a new position, we don't really have any way to know what impact I will have in this role. By way of context, just came off of about 18 months of work, really since the beginning of my time here, working on two teams that were invited to go the full distance on the Engineering Research Center's grants from the National Science Foundation. The first cycle of those, or first round, if they are funded, are about $20 million efforts. We were fortunate that, having submitted, I believe, 9 preliminary proposals in the fall of 2015, in February of last year, we got invitations for 2 of those to go forward with full proposals. So we spent from about February to June working on those. Then from about August until late October, we worked on preparation for the site visits. Both of our full proposals were invited to go for a site visit. So then now we're waiting any day now for those funding decisions. But the question really is, how do you measure the value of the 18 months spent on those processes? And see, I seem to have lost your slides. I can't see your slides anymore, Amanda. There we go. And so really then the question is, you know, should we be, and I have been tracking the process that we use, kind of keeping track, but how do I measure all of that work, the impact of that work, even if it doesn't result in funding next week or later in the month? Are there other ways to measure what kinds of successes we've had? Are there other things that we should be looking at? What else does the team work on? New relationships that are formed, new processes that we put in place on campus. So you're going to hear a little bit in a few minutes from another of our presenters talking about how we measure these things. And so we're looking forward to Betsy thinking about where the processes or the output measures are the most important, because there's another very important variable in this that we have to think about from my perspective as I communicate to my primary boss who's on the provost side, and that is, you know, do I have influence over certain things or do I have control over certain things? And how do you hold a person or an individual or a group accountable both for successes and failures when you're measuring processes versus outputs over which you may or may not have any control? Just like the ice storms that we get here in Atlanta. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so I really wanted to just kind of lay out the foundations for why I'm interested in this topic and to hear about what everybody else is doing in regard to working with their teams, measuring their value, measuring the processes and the outputs. So I was very excited to have Betsy step up and offer to share a little bit about what she's doing at the University of Wisconsin. So I'll turn it over to Betsy at this point.
Great, thanks, Nancy. So thank you very much for inviting me. And I thought I would just start out here telling you a little bit about myself to give you some background. I started out my academic career with a master's degree in library and information science. I was really interested by the Human Genome Project and how the databases and all the information that was being collected and how that could be pulled together. So that led me to the University of Washington's Information School, where I did the MLIS. After I finished that, I went on to the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center and worked doing some SharePoint portal development for some HIV/AIDS collaborations, and eventually ended up in this role as the senior project manager for the Asia Cohort Consortium Coordinating Center. And the Asia Cohort Consortium was sort of this loose affiliation of about 20 Asia-based cohort studies who had all been collecting data at different times on different populations and for different questions. And the point of the coordinating center was to help them all work together and come to an agreement on some important research questions that could be done across this 1 million+ participants. So things like, you know, what sorts of science should we do? What kind of data does each group have? And how can we get some of those data to be hosted at the Fred Hutch so we could do those analyses? So I took over this role leading the coordinating center. And really, I had no idea what a coordinating center was or what it should do. And there were no resources available. There nothing written, no real definition. But at the Fred Hutch, there were many very successful, long-running coordinating centers. So I could just walk down the hall and say, what should this coordinating center be doing? And by doing that, you know, I was able to start gathering some of these resources. And that led me to start thinking about how to study coordinating centers more intensively and to really understand what they were doing. So I wrote a grant to NCI and was eventually funded and to look at what the coordinating centers at the Hutch were doing. I also did some work with the TREC project, which some of you may know, the Transdisciplinary Research on Energetics and Cancer, looking at coordinating centers and productivity. Eventually, I began the PhD in Human-Centered Design and Engineering, also at the University of Washington, and wrote my dissertation, my dissertation on coordinating centers, their work, and the scientific impact. And in a couple of slides, I'm going to tell you just a little bit more about that work so that because I think it's the methodology of how I studied coordinating centers and their processes and the impact is relevant here. After I finished my PhD, I went to the National Cancer Institute as a cancer prevention fellow for a couple of years. And the first year of that fellowship is doing an MPH. So I did that at Hopkins, and then started working with the Healthcare Delivery Research Program under Paul Doria Rose, who works a lot on screening and questions about who gets screened and when. And while I was there, I was also able to talk to a number of program officers across the Institute about how they structure collaborative research and how they develop the RFAs for coordinating centers and large team science projects, which was very interesting. So now I am here at Wisconsin at the Carbone Cancer Center as the Assistant Director of Population Sciences. And I'm just going to give you, for those of you who are not familiar with cancer centers, just a quick overview so that you can understand this position a little bit better. So Carbone Cancer Center is one of 47 NCI designated comprehensive cancer centers. And these comprehensive cancer centers are, one of the defining characteristics is that they have a basic research division, a clinical research division, and a population sciences research division. And the idea is that all these divisions are working together in sort of the bench to bedside approach. They're also organized into what we call scientific programs. And here at Carbone, we have 6 of those. One of which is the Cancer Prevention and Control Scientific Program, which falls under population sciences. There's also one in radiology and imaging. There's one in developmental therapeutics and one in genetics. So those are sorts of the broad categories that people are put into. We are right now in the process of submitting our proposal for our funding renewal, which happens every 5 years. And bringing this back to the question of metrics, one of the main metrics for cancer centers is what we call inter and intra-programmatic collaboration. So thinking about that Cancer Prevention and Control Scientific Program, how many of the members are working with each other and how many of them are working with people in the other scientific programs. And by activities in those areas, we're talking about grants, publications, and sometimes meetings and workshops. How are they getting together and talking about things? So really the overarching goal of my position is to increase these activities and to get everyone working together. And what's kind of interesting about this position is that it has previously been a 25% position. But with the increasing focus on population sciences, both at NCI and NIH and through the Affordable Care Act, they decided that they were going to increase their investment in population sciences as a whole. So the way that I've started, building this part of the position in terms of research development and integrating across the different programs is by meeting with all the different cancer prevention and control members, starting with the assistant professors and sort of making my way up through the food chain, and really talking about what research development is, helping them develop their own research programs and strategies, thinking through what they want to be doing for their 5 year, 10 years down the road, and what are the steps that they need to get there. A lot of the assistant professors, of course, are currently have their K awards or just coming off a postdoc, and what do they do to get to that first R01? It's a big hump, and really they need a lot of help. Drawing upon my time at NCI to think about what are the appropriate funding opportunities, helping them identify collaborators, not only here at the University of Wisconsin, but across the country. Cancer epidemiology is really not a huge community, so having those contacts from my previous work has been really helpful. Helping them develop their specific games and coaching them on how to talk to the program officers and what happens when their review comes back. Again, having been on the inside, I think I have some really I have insights into how that process works that have been really helpful for them. And helping them work with the pre-award here at the Cancer Center and in their departments to submit. And really thinking about post-award then, with my research on developing collaborative infrastructures, how can we help them get up and running more quickly? And all of this, as Nancy said, is completely new to the university, and at least here in the Cancer Center. And really, here has also been very decentralized. It's a matrixed cancer center as opposed to a standalone freestanding like the Hutch, where at the Hutch, everybody who is a member of the cancer center is employed by the Fred Hutch. Here, the researchers are employed by their home departments, and then they can apply to be a member also in the cancer center. So their salary is mostly coming from their departments, and so trying to get people to work together within all those different organizational structures has been very challenging. So I'm really just getting started on this. I started here in May and have been working through some of these issues, and really the faculty are very excited about it, especially the early stage investigators who don't often get as much support as they need. But I'm starting to think about how to institutionalize the work that I'm doing, and what does that mean for the Cancer Center, and how to, what are some of the questions of how to show value. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So some of the things that I've really been thinking about are, what is the goal of this position that I would like to see it? And I think, we all research development is really a new field. We're coming from so many different backgrounds, and our roles are very different and all over the map. So I think it's very important to think through what exactly is the goal of my position. Is it more funding, or just encouraging these interdisciplinary conversations, which then will go on to grants that other people work on? Are we talking about deeper research integration, thinking about some of the work that Christine is doing? And really, who is the target audience for these metrics? Who am I trying to convince? And what do I want them to do with that information? I'm really starting first with my scientists and my faculty. I have to convince them, I think, that the services that I'm offering and the infrastructure that I'm developing to help them really does result in a better proposal and a greater odds of funding. And then I think once I've got the faculty convinced, then I can move on to the administration and thinking through, what does this do for the Cancer Center as a whole? And can we move beyond the population sciences and my cancer prevention and control faculty onto, something that is broader for the entire Cancer Center? So, like as Nancy mentioned, we were talking the other day about the actual act of developing metrics, and I can have meetings every day with my faculty, and we can come up with great ideas for what kind of grants they should write and how they should work with the program officers and interact with NCI. But until they actually write that grant, nothing is going to happen. I can't write that grant for them. So do I want to set myself up with these sort of outcome measures, like the number of grants that are awarded or the number of interdisciplinary centers that have been founded? Or do I want to think more about what I'm actually doing, which are these processes? Like, how many meetings am I having with faculty? How much time am I spending with them? How often do we get from the, research idea to the specific aims? So those are some of the, thinking through what kind of metrics, not just the actual metrics, but what kind of metrics do we need for this kind of role? Next slide, please. So I just wanted to tell you just briefly about my research on coordinating centers, because I think that there are a lot of similar challenges, and so it's one way to think about approaching the development of metrics, because we want our scientists to be doing evidence-based science. I think that we also want our metrics to be evidence-based. So for those of you who aren't familiar with coordinating centers, they're generally, at NIH anyway, funded as sort of a separate entity that coordinates the work of a bunch of research centers. So one of the coordinating centers I studied for my dissertation had three or four different research centers who were focused on questions about screening. And then the coordinating center helped them work together, helped develop common measures and common data elements that they were all collecting. They also did things like organizing conference calls, organizing meetings, some of the logistical and organizational stuff. But they also do have a strong scientific role in terms of helping the group work together and develop their scientific objectives. So, like I mentioned earlier, when I started looking at the question of coordinating centers, I was really surprised to see that NIH spends millions of dollars every year supporting these coordinating centers, but there wasn't really even an accepted definition of what a coordinating center is, or any sort of accepted definition of what the coordinating center does. And there was very little thought or writing about what the impact of having a coordinating center was. They're often thought of as sort of administrative structures, which in my research turned out not really to be the case. They also had a very strong impact on the science. But because we were starting with so little knowledge of what coordinating centers are and do, the idea of just starting with the scientific impact was not very attractive, because it wouldn't really help us understand the processes that were going on. So as we're thinking about developing these metrics, what I'd like to suggest is thinking through more of a qualitative approach to understanding those processes and outcomes from the perspective of the participants. And what I did with my coordinating center was I think it was 90 hours or so of observations over 6 months, going to meetings of the coordinating center, the large group in-person meetings, and also doing interviews with key participants. I did about 20 interviews. And really I asked them, what is it that you do? And what do you think is the impact of that work? And once you start to do that and you work through the questions of, what is everybody doing? How does that work come together? And how does that impact the scientific outcomes? Then you can start thinking about metrics and then develop sort of quantitative ways to test some of those concepts. So with that, I'll turn it back to Nancy.
Okay, thanks, Betsy. Yeah, I think the idea of having lots of metrics is going to be very helpful here. Just by way of context, my job is very similar to Betsy's, but without even the track record of being within a structure of a cancer center itself. We, again, have the 2 engineering research centers. As other center opportunities have presented themselves, certain faculty have chosen to go forward, but I seem to be, hitting up against resistance even to the concept of working together as being valuable. As an example, one other NSF program that I recently, we had an invitation to do a full proposal, reached out to the PI and said, this is research development. I'm relatively new here. These are some of the things that we could offer. And the response was, no worries, no need, we've got this. So in the context of working with teams of faculty, even the smallest of inroads and the smallest metrics in making headway, using some of the metrics and ideas that Betsy has proposed as possible ways to track things would be great. Next slide, please. Yeah, so we want to kind of conclude there and say, okay, you've heard a little bit about what our jobs are. We'd like to hear from you. What questions do you have? And then we'd definitely like to hear more about what you're doing in the way of measuring your impact on your campus and for your projects. So let's start off with any questions that you have, and we'll try to all, myself, Betsy, and Kris will unmute ourselves so that we can chime in when you ask a question.
Hi, this is Christine, and I don't know, is there a way on here we should raise our hands or something, just asking for...
I think there's a chat function.
Okay.
Don't know if there's a hand, I don't see a hand raising. I think we just kind of have to chime in and try not to talk over one another.
Okay.
If you click on the participants, mine has a list of everybody, and then there's a raise hand button at the bottom.
Ah,
yes.
There it is.
Okay. Can I raise my hand since I'm already talking?
Please.
Well, first I just wanted to say these are just 3 excellent presentations. So fascinating to hear about all of your different jobs, and
it's really gratifying to be able to have the time on this format. So thanks to the co-chairs, Amanda and Karen, for giving this forum, because when we get together annually, you don't have time to dig into everybody's jobs, but it's just really interesting. A couple of things that stuck out to me, I really think that in Kris's presentation, something she mentioned, just the power of naming, to create a centrally accepted concept that everyone can point to. And I feel like that's something that we've all come to in an ad hoc way. You know, the different methods for getting people from this fragmented group of activities toward a coordinated goal, even to, you know, and then to what you're saying, Betsy, a little bit upstream from that is just the idea that there would even be value in having a coordinated goal. And so I think that there's just so much opportunity for us to kind of figure out what we would do going forward. And my question would be, do you think that it makes sense for us to work on a group authored paper about these metrics, and maybe in some different categories, you know, metrics on for increased buy-in, you know, from upstream in the life cycle of a team, to metrics about the evidence of success down the road or in the formation of the team. So I'm just throwing that out there. But then to answer your question, I wanted to say that at our center, we've started to look at not only, so for example, I think maybe it was Nancy's proposal that would, or all of you have mentioned very big proposals that might be funded in the near future. And something that we do is not only look at whether that was funded, but then track the number of future proposals put together by relationships that didn't exist prior. So it's kind of a longer term. You have almost like the immediate feedback, but then how can you find ways to measure the softer formation of networks that are going to then come to fruition later? So I think it's just, we could be thinking about them not only in different categories of metrics in terms of what we're trying to show and who we're trying to convince of that, but then also the time horizon of the metric. So those are my thoughts on the topic, and mostly just wanted to thank you guys and throw out the idea that we could produce something together potentially.
So I think one of the issues with that is what counts, right? So what are you tracking, and how do you know when somebody who has been on a project that you've been working on goes off and makes, you know, two people go off and write a new grant together, especially in a large university like this where we're not centralized. I don't have any way really of tracking who's you know, doing that kind of work.
I can answer this. It's funny because I didn't even think of this, but I have done some work with what's called sociometric badges. Is there an echo? Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah?
There's a little echo, but.
Okay, so they're also called RFID tags. And so what we did was at two different conferences, interdisciplinary conferences about technology-enhanced learning, we had people wear these badges. And so what they did was track the face-to-face time that these different people had with each other during these conferences. And we, you know, had personal data about the people, their career level, their discipline, this kind of a thing. And then we tracked collaborations. We also had them answer questionnaires. And then we tracked new collaborations that could then have arisen from this face-to-face time. And so we've, I'm not saying that we should, in our different contexts, put sociometric badges on everybody, but this is a kind of a metric that we've used in similar contexts, and we're coming out with a paper a journal paper. Now we've got a different conference papers about the different relationships that we were able to discover. But it just made me think of that there are different ways of tracking interactions between people and what types of collaborative relationships that they lead to. Otherwise, in relation to a group authored paper on metrics, certainly that sounds definitely interesting.
And I have another question for both the presenters as well as the, those that are participating, which is, who's got expertise in social network mapping that might be valuable and offer those services to the group or tools?
This is Amanda. I just want to point out that it looks like Debbie Kornman has raised her hand. I don't know if that is accurate, but you have the floor, Debbie, if you'd like it.
Thank you. Thanks. So I'm at University of Connecticut. I'm a researcher, and I also am Associate Director of the Institute for Collaboration on Health Intervention and Policy, and we are very much focused on developing multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary collaborations between faculty here and faculty outside of here, and also with community partners. We find trying to track our success looking at metrics extremely challenging. I mean, yes, we look at number of grants submitted, we look at number of grants awarded, we even look at, publications, but like short of using sociometric badges or IFD, it's very hard to even get faculty to respond to us to figure out what happens. So we could bring people together and not know for sure where they've gone, and we find this incredibly challenging, which is why I'm on this particular webinar. But it's very hard to know. I mean, like, we put a lot of time and effort in. We have 2 boundary spanners working on this as well. And it's really hard to know what we can take credit for and what we can't as well.
Hi, this is Matt. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so I think one of you asked a question about tools for measuring networking.
Yes, that was me, Matt. Nancy.
Nancy. So that definitely got me thinking, because we have, so as part of the ERC program, we've been connected to this group called NanoHub. So it's nanohub.org. And so, so for some background for people on the call, I'm an administrative director for NEWT, based at Rice University, which is nanotechnology-enabled water treatment. And so we've been, actually our deputy director has been working with this NanoHub group to try to map the publications that are going on in the center. And so they're coming up with a diagram for us that creates, like, each person in our center that's publishing is a node. And then it draws the connections between those nodes. So they might be somebody to contact if you're looking for some more tools to try to diagram or quantify the interconnectivity that's going on in your centers.
I could maybe also speak to that question as well. I have some close colleagues here at the University of Lyon who are experts in modeling networks of any kind, and I've been working with them doing Sociometrics, where we're mapping the space of research in education using the Scopus database. And so it's a kind of a cluster analysis using what's called bibliometric coupling, where we map out all of research into different clusters of topics. And so there is specific software that is usable to create these kinds of networks that essentially give you shared knowledge databases in terms of who the researchers in different clusters are citing. So this is potentially something that could be mobilized.
I should tell you, the University of Connecticut has something very similar. I think, who was talking about it, Matt? And Harvard's developed something that's accessible to anybody, which is looking at these networks that have formed as a function of publications and grants. And it pulls from PubMed and a variety of sources, so you don't have to rely on researchers to give you the information. So that does give us some data, but like I said, and NIH actually funded Harvard to develop this, but it is available for universities to use. It has to be tailored to your particular university.
There's also the Sci2 tool from Katie Borner at Indiana, which I've tried to use before, and the disambiguation problem is not small. If you've got publications from 100 different researchers and you have to make sure to have everybody's name exactly the same and no duplication, it can be quite time consuming.
Any other questions for presenters, or should we move on ahead to thinking about other issues that we could look at? Christine, did you still have your hand up?
I put it back up after trying to wait and make sure I don't talk too much. But I did have a question for the three of you who have these established positions that are understood in the context of your organizations as coordinating roles. Do you feel that your value as it pertains to this role of integration and synthesizing ideas is something that you're having to individually advocate for through relationships, or do you think that it enjoys kind of a broader understanding in terms of what you're bringing? It's a tough way, it's a different way of asking the metrics problem, but just the sense that some of the integrative and synthesizing work that we do is invisible by nature, is more present in some instances of these jobs than others. And so just from your perspectives, do you have that feeling, and has it changed over the course of the development of your particular role? So that, I'll just leave it at that and let you answer open-endedly, I guess.
So Betsy or Kris, do you want to chime in first?
Okay, I'll chime in because my mic is still open. This is a tough one for me because it's funny, there's almost a response to give that is that I need to give before I can address the question. Because I'm in a context where the governance is being created from the bottom up, and because it's such a large and broad context as well, it's a whole region in a country where we're organizing all of the research in all disciplines that are occurring here in our local higher education establishments. You might imagine that there are a lot of people that have no idea what's going on even. I mean, they don't even know this is happening. So they don't even know that this coordinator role of an academic college exists. They don't even know what academic colleges are. They don't even know what the IDEX is, what the Initiative of Excellence is. And so yeah, the whole process and the whole thing is invisible. Not even my own role in it, but like the whole thing is invisible to many different people. And so that's really frustrating, just on that end. But when you look at something like this, at this kind of a scale, I mean, it's impossible for everybody to be engaged, for everybody to be informed. And so I guess there has to be, for somebody like me in this kind of appointed coordinator role, which doesn't really even officially at all, it's not a part of my professional activity, typically. I accepted to take this on in addition to my activities. There's a point where you have to say, okay, well, what's acceptable in terms of this being visible for me or for the community, and what can I do to make this initiative? It's almost like there has to be some kind of communication and marketing that is so far not successful. And where's the what is the word I'm looking for? Like the threshold at this level where we've succeeded in making sure that enough people know about it, that the existence of it is going to be able to move the whole process forward, if I'm clear enough. So it's not only just my own role as a coordinator, but it's the whole existence of the institution that is also a challenge.
That's really interesting. It's like a meta level issue for the whole macro scale of your organization that affects a lot of these individual roles too.
Right.
Well, thanks, Kris. Let me toss out a different perspective on that, because I mentioned the earlier example of a faculty member saying they didn't really see why they needed help putting together a center proposal. They managed to get it out the door on time, and that was fine, and it was reasonably in good shape. But it was very interesting, even as the individual's school chair and the dean of that college were involved in the conversations, they pretty much backed the faculty member and said, well, if he wants to do it alone, he can do it alone. We can't force him to kind of participate, on a different scale. And for us really now, with this sort of first test of these two major center grants, the credibility and the need for that level of support, it's either going to go sky high if we get funded for one of them, or it's going to have the bottom fall out of it if we're not funded and people say, see, we don't really need that. It didn't help at all. You just spent all that time and effort for nothing because we still didn't get funded. So they really see it as kind of a binary measure of success rather than the whole range of things that might come out of it. So we really have this very strong faculty dominant culture here, which prevents possibly good interventions, if you will, from taking root.
Eva Allen, it looks like you have your hand up.
Yeah, Nancy, I just wanted to jump in on the comment that you just made. I don't recall if you explained how deeply involved you were in the actual substance of those proposals that you're referring to, but it seems really important that you be able to distinguish your role from the rigor of the scientific content of the proposals. So it can often be the case that you help them as well as you could put together the submission that went in, and the reason that it doesn't get funded has nothing to do with the variables that you had any control over.
Exactly, and that goes back to Betsy's point about the notion of influence versus control.
Exactly.
And I didn't go into a lot of my background, but I moved into this from the faculty side of things. I have a PhD in biochemistry, but I don't get involved terribly in the science other than to say, I better be able to understand it. You need to be able to speak to somebody that's got a reasonable background in the sciences, whether you're talking about civil engineering and sustainability issues, or you're talking tissue engineering, or whatever the topic might be in the full realm of the sciences. For the engineering research centers in particular, they made the cut to the full proposal stage based on the interest that NSF had in the idea. The science gets spelled out in very gory detail in the full proposals. And from my understanding historically, and Matt maybe can jump in here as well, that it's a lot of the other variables having to do with how well the team functions, how well all of its components, its education and outreach, its cultures of inclusion, all of those pieces fit together, the quality of leadership, the evidence of real teamwork. So you try to facilitate those kinds of things in making the best case for funding. And so, you know, in terms of role, from the point of the invitation to full proposal, it was participation in each research group's weekly meetings, sometimes virtual meetings, but then also several fly-ins as we got close to the site visit. So very much embedded with the teams for that duration. Probably the first 6 months, not so much until we got the full proposal invites. But yeah, exactly, being held accountable for what they did and their behaviors is not really the best method for evaluating the impact.
Yeah, so I can jump in here because I was actually about to say something very, very much along these lines, because just getting funded for the proposal, I mean, that's a success point, but having a successful center is a totally different ballgame, right? So figuring out how these teams are going to work together and the different personalities involved in these centers. Like, I wish that I had been involved in this center before it was funded, although they, you know, obviously didn't have money for an administrative director previously. But it's just those things that are beyond the science that really result in your success that don't often get thought about until after the fact. And then you're living with promises that were made and relationships that were established after the proposal is funded. And so there's there's not a lot of metrics, I guess, I can put on that, except for, does your center, in the case of an ERC, for example, you have the potential for 10 years of funding from the NSF. And so a success metric would be, did our center survive for that entire 10-year period? Because they don't all do so. So it's one thing to get that initial grant, but you have to rewrite a sort of a re-up for funding in year 3. So that, you know, that centers often are they are either, you know, they can be scaled down if you're not executing on the initial strategy. And thinking about that ahead of time is really, really important. So, I mean, maybe I'm preaching to the choir here, but anyway.
I think that's one of the ways that we really add value, is that we can help investigators with those portions of the grant where they don't have any knowledge or skill set. And with the increase in team science, we're asking investigators to be HR managers and budget managers and team science experts and, you know, developmental psychology, everything. But by offloading that onto something like a research development professional, or like in the case of coordinating centers, then you're giving the scientists more time to actually do science.
And that's definitely an argument you can make to them. Like, hey, there's things that I can take off your plate that you get some of the mess out of the way so that they can focus on making those big breakthroughs.
Well, it looks like we have about 15 minutes or so left, and we've sort of hit some of the closing questions. So we want to skip ahead to, or skip to kind of thinking about where we wanted to wrap up for today with the, the rest of these ideas. We've sort of already talked about those things. Oh, can you go back one click? Yeah, these are some of the things that Betsy had put forward in terms of thinking even about who we're trying to reach in terms of metrics of success. Part of what came about with this is, in one of the questions that I posed to Karen Denby as we were organizing, was we as staff persons are sort of held accountable on an annual basis for performance reviews, for example, but yet most of what we do has a lifespan much, much longer than that 1 year. Same kind of challenges that faculty face in recognizing that you've got your own outcomes from projects, but yet it was not just you or your work that caused it to fail or succeed. And so thinking about some of the questions that Betsy raised for us, especially the notion of who is your audience and what are you hoping to accomplish by collecting various metrics about your work, what you expect that they will do with that. Does anybody want to chime in or have some thoughts about that? See if any hands go up. Nobody has any ideas. Okay, well, how about I hand it back to you, Amanda, for kind of closing comments then?
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. Well, that's
okay.
good. Thank you so much, Nancy, for guiding us through this conversation, and thanks to Kris and Betsy for their insights and experience, sharing of their experience. Thanks also to all the participants who talked about some of the things that have come to their mind as we progressed over the last hour and a half. So, this last slide here asks the question, what platforms would work best for the Interreach group, this group, to share ideas, metrics, strategies, and best practices around this topic? I know Christine Hendren already suggested the idea of a group-authored paper, which I think, sounds like it has some promise and there might be some interest in the group. How might, if we hold that as an immediate sort of short-term goal, what would be the strategy for organizing people around that topic and into sharing the writing responsibilities for that? Any ideas?
I have an idea, and it depends on, what we've done for the job description bank was just create the lowest lift technological solution there is in a Google spreadsheet. And so if we wanted to do that for this, I could do a very similar thing and, capture I can a priori guess a couple of topics that might be, that might make good column headings, right? So metric, audience, what are we trying to show? What's the method of assessing reporting? And what are the barriers? So not being able to get faculty to respond to a survey for whatever reason. And then what would you have to do to get around that barrier? Okay, then somehow make some sort of administrative encouragement or whatever. I could just throw that out there for the group, for whoever would want to respond. But also, it's we have another month before the application process closes for suggesting sessions for the sites meeting. So for people who are planning to attend, we could propose a whole session around just talking about metrics. People could go through what's already existing, of people. We could have, a couple of different types of examples, and then a discussion around that. So if you think that this would make sense to bring more people in, then maybe we can propose something like that.
That certainly seems like it's much easier to work on these kinds of projects face to face. I would think having a convening of folks with an interest in this topic would probably be more productive in a shorter time period than trying to motivate folks to go to the Google Doc. What do others think?
It really depends on how many people are going to sites.
Yeah.
Certainly, having come off of these ERCs, it's amazing what just a difference of some face-to-face interaction can do to get people gelling that maybe were a little bit distant to begin with. I mean, physically and mentally disengaged, bringing them back into the fold. So that's a great idea. I have to take a poll of who all will be there.
Mm-hmm. Christine, would doing, I guess, a poll through the InterReach listserv be feasible to take the temperature and see who might be interested in attending a session of that nature?
Yeah, and I mean, I guess what we'd want to do is, if we're proposing the session, we'd want to have the idea of maybe 3 people who had something to say, to present. And I'm sure I can think of a few that might already. I don't know, maybe if everybody has access to the Zoom field, everyone who is planning to go that's on this call, could you raise your hand and we can do a quick count here?
So I think
we're talking about, just to make sure, we're talking about going to the next Science of Team Science conference, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just so you know, I also put the link in the chat earlier.
Okay.
Oh, okay, that's it.
So it looks about 5 out of 13 left on the phone. So a little less than half.
Yeah, I probably will not be going, but I would still like to participate. So there may be some option to get this kicked off at the Nordic meeting, if anybody's going to that.
You know, it might not be a bad idea to have this forum there, just because you have the population of a lot of the audience members, the people who were going to be reached by these metrics, at a lot of those places.
Yeah, it wouldn't necessarily have to be we wouldn't have necessarily a forum, but even just a gathering, or sometime when we meet to get, lunch or whatever together.
Would there be any value in trying to do some type of questionnaire of people, asking them what they're doing and using for metrics, or how confused they are about metrics, so you would have some data to actually use in a paper?
That's a great idea, and it's actually how we started. For many of you all might have been respondents to our survey that we threw out last year as a precursor to the first InterReach workshop, and we got back some really good input. It was basically became the job bank. But if we could think about the things we'd want to ask people and keep it as simple as possible, I would think possibly this table, if we are to set up the metrics table in a shared Google Drive and throw it to the listserv. The listserv has about 130 members now, so if we were to get any kind of decent response rate, that'd be a lot of good input.
And which table are you talking about, Amanda? Or was that Christine?
This is Christine.
Okay.
But I'm talking about if I were to create a shared Google document that we could populate with the columns of, metric, audience, what are we trying to show, that type of a thing, and then have people fill out what they what they want to contribute, then people can add to it. And the nice thing about that is they can see what other people have already said. So I will be happy to create a new thing that looks like that and send it to everybody if you like.
I think that's great. I see another value for that, and maybe a second checkbox in the columns to say, okay, is this something that you have, or is it something that you wish you had?
Mm-hmm. That's a great idea.
But even just capturing what people have gives others the option to go and look for, oh, I'll talk to this person to look at their tool or their survey or their data collection process or whatever it might be. Excellent, great. That sounds like a great idea.
Christine, when you send out the link to that table, would you want to include, I assume in the message to the listserv, the question of who might be interested in a session and at which meeting would be most useful or easiest to facilitate?
Yeah, and then, yeah, and if it's NORDIP, maybe ask who would like to lead it, because I don't attend that meeting, but I know many of us do. So we could hit both of them, really.
Mm-hmm.
I think Betsy and I figured out that at least the two of us were going to be attending NORDIP, right, Betsy?
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry,
okay.
I had to unmute.
Yeah, that's, I didn't mean to catch you quiet over there. Yeah. There'll be a few, and I know that there were a couple of people when I was working with Karen to identify potential presenters today. There were several people that were also approached that were unable to participate today that were very interested in the topic, and so we've sort of kept track of those folks and see what their availability and interest would be in having further conversations.
Great.
They're probably on your overall list as well, so I'm sure they will be picked up in the mix somewhere along the way.
Mm-hmm. Well, great. It sounds like we have a concrete next step. So thank you for stepping